Steakhouses, once the kings of American dining, where a sizzling steak and a side of buttery mashed potatoes meant pure indulgence. But today, many of these legendary spots are struggling, closing, or being replaced by new food trends. So, what happened? Do you like steak? I do, and if you're watching this, I'm guessing you do too. There's nothing quite like a thick, juicy, perfectly grilled steak served with a side of carbs so heavy you could hibernate for the winter. The Great American Steakhouse, an institution built on sizzling beef, indulgent side dishes, and the promise of a meal fit for a king. But despite their long reign, these once mighty steakhouses aren't what they used to be. Their popularity has faded, overtaken by shifting food trends and changing tastes. So, what happened? Today we're sinking our teeth into the rise and fall of American steakhouses, how they became icons of dining culture, and why they're struggling to stay relevant. Before we dig in, make sure to subscribe to Weird History Food and drop a comment below. What restaurant trends do you want us to explore next? Alright, vampires beware, because we're about to serve up some steaks. Technically speaking, steak isn't a type of meat, it's a way of cutting and cooking it. If you take a thick slice of meat, cut across the muscle, and grill it over high heat, boom, you've got yourself a steak. Historically, steak first appears in the records back in the 15th century, when Scandinavian butchers were slicing thick cuts of meat and calling them snastaka, or stick, meaning roasted meat. The idea spread across Europe, and by the time it reached England, people were grilling venison and beef like medieval foodies. But the steak we know and love today, that comes from Italy, specifically Florence, during the Renaissance. Around 1565, the Florentines celebrated St. Lawrence's feast day by cooking huge slabs of meat over open flames. Why? Because St. Lawrence, a Roman martyr, was burned to death on a grill. Grim, I know. They called this dish bistecca, and it's believed that English merchants picked up the name, turning it into beef steak, which later became just steak. America's love affair with beef actually predates the country itself. It all started in the early 1500s when Spanish explorers brought cattle to North America. As settlers expanded westward, they took their herds with them, laying the foundation for what would become a cattle ranching empire. But here's the twist. Beef wasn't even the main attraction back then. Early American ranchers didn't raise cows for steak. They raised them for hides and tallow. A rendered fat used to make candles and soap. The real beef boom didn't happen until the late 19th century, when railroads made it easier to transport cattle across long distances. Suddenly, fresh beef was more accessible, and demand skyrocketed. Before long, beef wasn't just food, it was a symbol of prosperity, rugged individualism, and the American way of life. And at the center of it all, the iconic steakhouse. When you think of the Wild West, what comes to mind? Rugged cowboys riding the open range, driving massive herds of cattle across the plains. Well, there's a reason that image is so iconic. Cattle ranching was a huge part of early American life. And the cowboys who kept those herds moving, they became folk heroes. But by the early 20th century, new technology was about to change everything. First came barbed wire fences, which helped ranchers protect their herds and put an end to open range conflicts. Then came refrigerated railroad cars, allowing fresh beef to be shipped across the country. These innovations supercharged the beef industry, making steak more accessible than ever. By the mid-1900s, traditional ranching was giving way to feedlots, large-scale operations designed to maximize efficiency and profits. Beef companies also started selectively breeding cattle to grow faster and yield more meat. But here's the catch. The beef industry isn't without its problems. With growing concerns over climate change, resource consumption, and sustainability, some experts have started questioning whether the entire system is viable long term. It's a challenge the industry is still wrestling with today. Americans may have perfected the steakhouse experience, but they didn't invent it. In fact, the first steakhouses popped up in London in the 1690s, long before the United States even existed. These early spots were called chop houses, named after the individual chops of meat they served. They were simple, no-frills eateries where workers could grab a hot meal, but not all steak-loving Brits were eating in working-class chop houses. The wealthy had their own exclusive dining tradition, beefsteak banquets. Unlike chop houses, these weren't restaurants. They were invite-only feasts for the upper class, where high society gathered to enjoy endless platters of meat. So, when American colonists arrived, they were already familiar with these beef-centric dining traditions, but the true American steakhouse, that came later, and it didn't start with chop houses or banquets. It started with bars and inns. The very first true steakhouse in the U.S. may have been Delmonico's in New York City, opened in 1837 by Swiss-Italian immigrant brothers Giovanni and Pietro Delmonico. This wasn't just any restaurant, it was one of the first American dining establishments to actually call itself a restaurant. Fun fact, the Delmonicos borrowed that word from the French, who used it to describe upscale eateries. Delmonico's quickly became world famous, especially for its signature dish, the Delmonico steak. This legendary cut, thick and juicy, set the gold standard for steakhouses to come, but it didn't stop there. A few decades later, New York's Old Homestead Steakhouse opened in 1868, becoming the oldest continually operating steakhouse in the country. Then, in 1885, Keen's Steakhouse joined the scene, adding its own stamp on the industry. Steakhouses were here to stay, but their golden age, that was still to come. Steakhouses weren't just popular with everyday folks. Some of the biggest names in American history were regulars. Keen's Steakhouse, which opened in New York City in 1885, became a go-to spot for icons like Babe Ruth, J.P. Morgan, General Douglas MacArthur, and even President Teddy Roosevelt. Can you imagine those guys sitting around waiting for their steaks? What were they even talking about? The stock market, baseball, the best way to wrestle a bear. But don't get the wrong idea. New York didn't have a monopoly on legendary steakhouses. The Buckhorn Exchange in Denver has been serving up steaks since 1893, making it one of the oldest continuously operating steakhouses outside of New York. St. Elmo's Steakhouse in Indianapolis has been in its original location since 1902, a true Midwestern institution. Pacific Dining Car in Los Angeles, founded in 1921, became so iconic that it appeared in movies like Chinatown and Training Day, and in Chicago, Gene and Giorgetti has been dishing out steaks since 1941, making it the city's oldest steakhouse. But if you really want to make big money in the restaurant industry, you don't just open one location, you start a chain. In 1958, Sizzler Steakhouse was founded in California, and it flipped the traditional steakhouse model on its head. No fancy table settings, no exclusive clubs, just affordable, casual, family-friendly steak dinners, and Americans loved it. By the 1960s, Sizzler had expanded into one of the biggest steakhouse chains in the country, with over 270 locations at its peak. Its success kicked off a steakhouse revolution, inspiring a wave of budget-friendly chains that made steak more accessible than ever. And if there was one thing Americans in the 60s were obsessed with, besides steak, it was cowboys. Cowboy culture was everywhere, on the big screen, on TV shows like Gunsmoke, The Lone Ranger, and Bonanza. So it was only a matter of time before someone combined steak with the Wild West. That someone was Dan Blocker, one of the stars of Bonanza. After leaving the show, he opened Bonanza Sirloin Pit, a Western-themed steakhouse in Westport, Connecticut. It was a massive hit, and, of course, when something works, people copy it. 2 years later, businessmen Norm Weiss, Dan Lasseter, and Charles Kleps launched Ponderosa Steakhouse in Kokomo, Indiana, named after the ranch from Bonanza. Like Sizzler, these cowboy-themed steakhouses ditched the upscale, white tablecloth vibe in favor of a laid-back, family-friendly atmosphere. Customers loved the combination of steak, baked potatoes, salad, and square deal prices. For the next 2 decades, Bonanza and Ponderosa went head-to-head, battling for cowboy steakhouse supremacy. But in the 1980s, they finally decided to join forces, merging into a single company with nearly 700 locations. Now that is a lot of beef. And then there's Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. Yes, that's the actual name. Sounds a little confusing, right? Well, it all started back in 1927 when a small steakhouse called Chris's Steakhouse opened in New Orleans. But how it became Ruth's Chris? That's a story for another